This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, hi, welcome everyone. Let's start a session. So in a previous session, what we discussed, we onboarded two applications. We talked about application onboarding, and we onboarded two authoritative applications, one dedicated application for employees and one dedicated application, authoritative application for contractors. So this is the two applications or system of record that we onboarded in our previous session. And this is how our data looked like. So if I go to my data over here, so if I go over here to identities, identity warehouse, identity warehouse, this is how our data looked like. So over here, currently when I go to identities, we have two problems in our current architecture. So let's look at what are the problems and how we could remediate them. The first problem that we have in our current architecture is that we have less number of identity attributes defined. So the reason is over here. See, if I look at my feed file over here, this is my feed file, and over here I have lot of application attributes. So this is my authoritative application. This is authoritative application. So we have identity schema. The identity schema is generally, so identity schema that we have in identity schema is generally populated from authoritative application. So I'm calling that identity schema is generally populated from authoritative application. What is identity schema? See, when I go to global settings, when I go to identity mappings, this is called identity schema. So in identity schema, currently we have less number of attributes compared to what we have in our authoritative application. This is my authoritative application. So over here, we have need to define extended attributes. So for example, we don't have attributes like cost center, location, region. So what we have to do is we have to define our extended attributes to solve our first problem. So to solve a first problem, we will have to define extended attributes. The second problem that we have, now if I go inside my identity warehouse, and if I open any identity, currently what we see over here, the data is not getting populated. Apart from username, which is getting populated because of the display name attribute that we defined inside our authoritative application, other attributes are not getting populated over here. So the second problem is SailPoint currently does not know how to populate values of identity attributes. This is the second problem. Currently, our values of identity attributes are not getting populated. So these values are not getting populated. To solve our first problem, we have already talked about that we will be defining extended attributes. So extended attributes we have defined, we have already talked about the process in previous session. So we will be defining extended attributes at identity level. So I will go ahead to solve my first problem. Since I would like to store these attributes at my identity level as well, like location, region, cost center, right now they are going inside my application link. So I have an application link. They're going inside over here. Over here, all my attributes are available. Now, since authoritative application is central to my implementation, I would also like to store these values at identity level. So this is application schema. I would also like to store them at identity level, meaning going to global settings, and going to identity mappings. Identity mappings over here. So over here, by default, we only have standard attributes available. We will add extended attributes our end so that the values that are coming in from authoritative application, I could also store them at identity level. So over here, we can go ahead and add new attributes. So I could go ahead and add new attributes over here, like status, and I will make sure that I add them in my Hibernate file and again run my script. So all those things you will do. So over here, we could define different attributes, whatever we want. So for example, status, cost center, we could define these attributes over here. This will solve my first problem of having less number of attributes at identity level compared to my authoritative application. Satish, please rejoin. Others are able to hear me, right? Please confirm on the chat window if you're able to hear me. Okay, okay, thank you. Okay, so for solving first problem, what we have done, we will be defining these extended attributes. Remember that whatever attributes that you define at identity level are central to your implementation. Why we define attributes at identity level? Because these will be acting like your global attributes or identity level schema, sale point schema. And generally, you try to match these attributes with your authoritative application. Now, since in my authoritative application, I had attributes which are not available by default at identity level, I have modified my identity schema to add extended attributes. Again, the whole process we have already discussed, how we can go ahead and define extended attributes. So this will solve my first implementation problem, having less number of attributes, identity attributes defined. So we are defining extended attributes to solve this problem. The second problem is currently values of these attributes are not getting populated. So when I go inside identity warehouse, open any identity, only username is getting populated. The other identity attributes are not getting populated. So to solve this problem, we have something called source mapping. Now, what is source mapping? Source mapping defines what will be the source of this identity attribute. So what will be the source of this identity attribute? So since we want that their values should be populated, we will be defining source mapping in these identity level attributes, thereby telling SailPoint how to calculate these values. So let us look at source mapping. So to solve my first problem, I have defined all my extended attributes over here. That is the first point I have done. Apart from standard attributes, we have defined extended attributes over here. So let us look at first name over here. So when I go to first name, by default, source mapping will not be available neither in standard attributes nor in extended attributes that you define. So by default, SailPoint does not know source of any attribute. So this is a standard attribute over here. I'm going to this standard attribute. I'm clicking on add source. Now either I could map it to a attribute, either I could write a rule, or either I could map it to global rule. So source mapping can be attribute level, can be application rule, or can be global rule. So either I could map it to a particular application attribute, or either I could write a rule to calculate its value, or either I could write a global rule independent of any application. So map it to an attribute, write a rule, or a global rule. In this case, we are saying that I would like to map it to a application attribute. So I'm selecting HR system employees. I'm mapping it to first name over here. So right now what we are saying, that this attribute first name is which level? Identity level attribute. Now I'm telling SailPoint how should the value of this attribute should be calculated. I'm telling SailPoint that I have an attribute called first name on my authoritative application. Whatever value is in this application attribute, the same value should be stored at identity level. So this is my source mapping where I am mapping it to an application attribute. Similarly, contractor feed, and I'm mapping again to, these are the application attributes available. I'm mapping it to first name. So when I add these two source mappings, now SailPoint is aware how this first name identity level attribute should be populated. It will be sourced from these two target applications, which are my authoritative applications, HR system employees and contractor feed, and will be mapped to an attribute first name existing on these target applications. Now let us look at another attribute over here. So let us look at display name. So display name is my identity level attribute that we have defined. It's an out of the box attribute, display name. So it's a standard attribute. Now if I go to add source, now on my target application, there is no attribute called display name. So these are my applications that we have onboarded. We don't have an attribute called display name. So over here, when I'm selecting HR system employees application, I'm saying map it to full name attribute. So again, what will happen? Whatever value is in this full name attribute of this target application, the same value will be displayed in display name, which is my identity level attribute defined at SailPoint level. So this value that is in this full name attribute will be populated into this identity level attribute. So over here we have defined two source mapping, full name from contractor feed and full name from HR system employee application. Now over here, let's say we have a custom requirement now. As I said, either you could map it to an attribute like I have shown you. You could write an application level rule or a global rule independent of all application. Now let's say I have a business requirement, and the business requirement is, now I should be able to know the status of the user that is getting onboarded, and this status should be displayed on my identity cube. So this is my requirement over here, that when a particular record is getting created in SailPoint, I should also be able to know the status of that attribute, whether it is an employee or a contractor. So right now, if I look at my feed file, there is no attribute that could be mapped directly. No attribute over here displays the status, whether it is a contractor or whether it is an employee. So in such cases, we could either go for an application rule or can go for a global rule when we have no attribute available to which it could be mapped. So in this case, we have one advantage. The advantage is that all my contractor data is in a separate feed file and all my employee data is in a separate feed file. This is our advantage, that for our records, we have separate feed file. So we are writing a rule in this case, since we cannot map it to any attribute. We have defined one extended attribute, and this extended attribute, I have defined the status. So over here, this is the extended attribute I've defined status. And right now, since we cannot map it to an attribute, we are mapping it to rule. So when I say add source, now if I select my application HR system employees, I cannot map it to any existing attribute on this target application to calculate the value of this identity level attribute. So in this case, we are mapping it to a rule, application rule. As I said, we have this advantage that we have separate feed files for employees and contractor. So if the record is returned from contractor feed file, in my rule, I will say return contractor, thereby identifying that this is a contractor getting onboarded. If the record is returned from employee feed file, I'm saying return employee, since the record is returned from my employee feed file over here. So we are leveraging a rule to calculate the value of the attribute. So over here, if the record is returned from employee feed file, I'm writing a rule. I'm saying return employee. It returns attribute value. So we are returning over here the value of the attribute that should be populated. So this rule should return a value. So in this case, we are returning employee. Similarly, if the record is returned from contractor feed application, we are saying return contractor. So in this case, we are leveraging a rule since the attribute was not available to populate its value. Similarly, in our source mapping, we could also go for global rule, which will be independent of any application. So application rule is dependent on application. Global rule is independent of any application. So leverage whatever you want, either map it to an application attribute, either write a rule to calculate its value, or map it to a global rule independent of all application. So what we have done, two things. First of all, defined extended attributes in our schema, identity schema, then defined these primary source mapping that will help SailPoint determine these values. Then you see a lot of advanced options over here, like advanced, like group factory, searchable. So what are these advanced options we will talk about? So in my identity schema, I also see some advanced options. So these advanced options are, one we have already talked about, source mappings. Then we have group factory. We have searchable, edit mode. Then we have attribute sync or target mappings. Then we have multi-valued. So when we are defining our identity schema, we could also define some advanced options. And these are the advanced options we could define. So source mapping, we have already discussed. It helps calculate the source of the identity attribute. This we have already discussed. What is group factory? While defining your identity schema, if you mark any attribute as group factory, this is considered a special attribute. Leveraging this attribute, we could create static groups in SailPoint. So we could create static groups in SailPoint over here if we mark this attribute as group factory. Let us see this impact. So for example, over here, I'm marking cost center as group factory, again inactive, location, manager, region, status. So when I go inside a particular attribute, I could mark it as group factory. What is this group factory? Now this allows to create static groupings leveraging that attribute. So when I go to groups, set up groups. So over here we have group factory. So I could say create a new group. So these group attributes that are available are all coming from my identity schema. All these attributes are marked as group factory. So whatever attributes that you see over here, these are the attributes that are marked as group factory. They're available over here. So apart from assigned and detected roles, which are available by default, The other attributes that I see, like status, region, manager, inactive, location, cost center, are the ones that are marked as group factory in your identity schema. I'm calling them as static groups since they are not automatically updated. They are static in nature. They are not automatically updated. You will have to run your refresh task to update these group factories. Why they are important? Because once you have groupings available, you could easily launch your compliance module on these. Things like doing certifications. So things like doing certifications or risk modeling or policies, so all that could be easily launched once you have these static groupings available. So for example, over here, I have leveraged these group attributes to create some static groups. Let me show you its advantage. So for example, I've created a grouping on location. So for every location, I have these users available. So I have these users available. So for example, today I want to create a policy for people in Austin location. I have this subgrouping available. So I could easily go ahead and launch a policy for this, create a policy for this people in this Austin location. The disadvantage is these are not automatically updated. They are static groupings. So what is this group factory? Marking a particular attribute as group factory, it will be available to create static groupings in SailPoint. We have another option called populations, which is apart from this, and these are dynamic groupings. So static groupings is driven by identity schema by marking attributes as group factory. We have populations as well, which is a separate grouping, and these are dynamic groupings. So let us see how populations are created. So populations are directly created by going to intelligence, advanced analytics. You could go to intelligence, advanced analytics, and I am currently in identity search. So in your identity search, give your conditions. For example, I'm saying I would like to see users in this particular location, Brussels, and I would only like to see my employees. So when I'm running my search, these are the lists provided. It is saying there are 18 users that are employees in Brussels location. So these are employees in Brussels location. I could select these users. And save it as a population over here. I can select them, click on this drop down. I can save identities as population over here. So I could say employees in Brussels. I could save this. So now I would be able to see them, this population over here, and these are dynamic groupings. So when I go to setup groups, open in new tab over here, and I go to populations over here, and I would be able to see these populations getting created. So this is employees in Brussels. When I open this, I would be able to see users currently in this particular population. So there are 18 users. Now this is dynamic in nature, and group factory is static in nature over here. The reason is populations work on filters. So let us see these populations. So they are dynamic in nature, they are automatically updated. So let's say today there is a new user joining in Brussels location that will automatically be added to this population. The reason is, see, when I go to debug page, I'm going to debug page of SailPoint. And when I open this group definition, they are called group definition in debug page. And when I open this, so this is my population that we created, employees in Brussels. So you see, these are composite filters that are run every time you refer a particular population. This makes them dynamic. So every time you open a population or you refer a population, these composite filters are run against your database. And whatever users are satisfying the criteria are being populated in that population. So they are dynamic in nature, but growth factories are static. So these are dynamic, they will automatically be updated because they run on these composite filters. So every time these filter conditions would be run, that is, if the user's location is Brussels and status is employee. So all the users will automatically be part of this population. So they are dynamic in nature. So we talked about group factory that is driven from identity schema by marking attribute as group factory. And then we talked about populations that are created from analytics. So populations are created from advanced analytics and they are dynamic in nature. So one static grouping, one dynamic grouping over here. Then we have searchable over here. So when I go to my identity schema, I could also mark attributes as searchable. So I could go ahead and in advanced options, I could mark attributes as searchable. The impact of this is, so there are two requirements. The attribute over here should be marked as searchable. And as we have discussed in the past, in your Hibernate file, an index should be defined for that attribute. So index should be defined. We have already discussed that, we'll not again go into that. So index should be defined for that particular attribute. If these two are defined, the impact of this is all your searchable attributes will be available in your advanced analytics. So for example, over here, I have department, employee ID, then location, region, and status marked as searchable. So when I go to advanced analytics, so all these are available over here. So you could see searchable attributes. So the impact of this is they're added in your search criteria. You would be able to search SailPoint leveraging your searchable attributes. So I could search attributes, I could search in SailPoint leveraging this location, leveraging region, leveraging employee ID. So all that I would be able to do since these attributes are marked as searchable in my identity schema. Then we have very important option called edit mode. Now this edit mode over here, as we talked about in our auditing class, we have three edit modes available. So one is read only, the second is temporary, and the third is permanent over here. So these are the edit modes that could be defined in attributes. Now read only is attributes that could not be edited leveraging SailPoint forms. So these attributes that are marked as read only cannot be edited. Only temporary and permanent attributes could be edited. So for example, in my schema over here, all my attributes are marked as read only. So when I go to cost center, it is marked as read only. Edit mode is marked as read only. Only my department attribute is marked as permanent. Edit mode is marked as permanent. So when I go to department, you can see in advanced option, it is listed as editable. And over here, the edit mode is marked as permanent. So only your editable attributes will be edited using SailPoint forms. For example, I'm going to manage identity, edit identity for others. And when I select any identity to edit, only attributes that are marked as editable would be displayed. So I could only edit my department over here. Only attributes for which edit mode is marked as temporary or permanent could be edited in SailPoint. Now, what is this temporary or permanent? So this is very important to understand. So let's say we have a user John, which is having one identity attribute, and this identity attribute is phone number. So over here, let's say this phone number was originally calculated to 100. So over here, this was calculated from source mapping. So from source mapping, the source mapping over here, the value of this identity attribute for John, the phone number was calculated as 100 from source mapping. Now let's say by leveraging sale point form, since this is an editable attribute, it is marked as temporary, it is editable attribute. I change this phone number of the user from 100 to 101. So I'm changing it to 101. The source mapping was calculating it as 100, but leveraging the form, I'm calculating it as I'm changing it to 101. So this will become the new master value, but this will become the new master value as temporarily. It will not be permanent, which means when I rerun my refresh task or when I rerun my aggregation task, this value again would get changed to 100. So in this case, in temporary, when attribute is marked as temporary, it is editable, but source mapping is the final source of truth. Source mapping is the final source of truth. Even if you're changing the value from sale point form, it would be overwritten, and the value that is coming from source mapping, that would be the final value. So in which case I will mark them? So generally when you are doing workflow testing, so for example, you do testing over here and testing in case of event-based workflows. So when we do these kind of testing and we would like certain workflows to get triggered based on attribute change or value change, we generally leverage this temporary to do testing of our workflow. So generally this temporary is leveraged for testing. Remember, marking it as temporary will make it editable, and source mapping will be the final source of truth. What is permanent over here? Again, if an attribute is marked as permanent, it would be editable. And in this case, let's pick up the same use case. So in this case, let's say John was having this value of phone number as 100 from source mapping. Now leveraging sale point form, I have marked it to 101. So this will become the new master value permanently. So in this case, source mapping is ignored. So when this is leveraged, so for example, let's say you're allowing your users to change their personal information. Let's say you're maintaining their personal information in SailPoint. You're allowing them to say change their phone number. So you want that the phone number could be editable by the user, and you want that this should be the master value. So in that case, you can mark it as permanent. In that case, source mapping, the source of this attribute that is configured would be ignored. Whatever value that we are setting from the sale point form would be the new master value, and this would be the new permanent value of that particular attribute. So understanding these edit modes is important. Read only, which is not editable; temporary, in which source mapping is the final source of truth; permanent, in which sale point form, the value that are setting from sale point form, is the final value that is being displayed over here. So give me 5 minutes, I will pick up your questions. Then you have attribute sync, which is done using target mappings. What is this attribute sync? So just like you have source mapping, you also have target mapping. What was source mapping? To calculate the source of the attribute. Target mapping is to push this value to target systems. So what do we mean by to push this value to target systems? let's say I have a value stored in identity attribute. I have a value stored in identity attribute, and I want that this value should be sent to my target systems. So then we could leverage target mapping, which is generally used for attribute synchronization. So for example, we took an example of full name. So full name, then display name, and then let's say see an attribute over here. So full name, let's say this was on my authoritative application. Display name is my identity attribute. So what I was doing over here, I was saying that for this identity attribute, I'm defining one source mapping, that this would be mapped from my authoritative application full name attribute. So in this case, what was happening, whatever value was in full name attribute of authoritative application, since source mapping is defined, the same value was displayed on this display name attribute. Now let's say we have a value in this display name, and I want that the name of the user should be same across my different target applications. So let's say I have a application over here, LDAP. So I can define a target mapping it to a particular attribute CN. So what will happen, whatever value is in display name, the same value would be pushed to LDAP application CN attribute. So target mapping is generally leveraged for attribute synchronization when there is a need to have the common value to our downstream applications as well. For example, going back to analytics mappings over here, global settings mappings, I can go to identity mappings. So I could go to display name. So you could see over here in display name is my identity level attribute. So this is my identity level attribute, and these are the source mappings defined. So I could go down, add a target mapping. I'm saying add target now. So I could select any configured application. I'm selecting LDAP, and these are the attributes available. So I'm saying CN, and I could go ahead and add this. So when I add this, a new target mapping is available. So whatever value is in this attribute display name, the same value would be pushed to LDAP application CN attribute. So this could also be done to achieve synchronization on attribute sync. Just like you have a source mapping, you could also have a target mapping to target a particular application attribute. Multi-valued we already know. So this is attributes that are holding multiple values. So if your attribute will be holding multiple values, you can mark it as multi-valued in your identity schema. Okay, some of the questions on the chat window. Okay, could you please repeat the population generation? So you have understood, or should I repeat? Let me know if you understood, or should I repeat? Okay, so population is generally a dynamic population that is created. They are dynamic in nature, that could be created from analytics. So whatever attributes that are available in analytics, you could go to intelligence, you could go to advanced analytics and create these populations over here. So go to analytics. Over here, you have different search criteria available. So give in your search criteria. For example, I'm saying that I would like to filter out users belonging to a particular department. So I'm saying I would like to get users of engineering department, and I run my search over here based on my criteria. So 36 results are returned. So then I could select these users and save them as population over here. Save identities as population. So when I save these, this is dynamic in nature. So you could see this population is saved. So when I go to setup, I go to groups. So I'm calling it as a dynamic in nature. The reason is when I go to populations and look at this, so this is the population that we created. And now over here, it is having now 36 users over here. So it is dynamic because in the backend, we have an object called, so I will open it in new tab. And this object that we have is called group definition. So this is the object over here, and whatever population that you're creating, it is dynamic because every time you refer this population or open this population, these composite filters would be run. So these filters would be run, so there could be new users joining in this particular department. So all your population will get refreshed automatically. Since every time you open a population, these composite filters are run to calculate the values dynamically of which users qualify in this particular population. So populations are dynamic groupings that could be created from analytics. Let me know if it is clear. So they're dynamic groupings, and the reason is why they are important. Since when you do targeted policies, you do targeted certifications, you could leverage these groupings of users. So that is when then these are important. What is the purpose of add this source as target? So in this case, add this source as target, your source mapping will get added as target as well. So if you say add this source as target, you could go to identity mappings. Let's look at cost center. I'm saying add source. For example, I'm saying add source over here, and I'm saying I would like to add source from, let's say, LDAP application. Any application I could leverage. So I'm saying, okay, CN, for example, I say add the source as target, add over here. You could see it is added as a source mapping as well as a target mapping over here as well. So add the source as a target, we'll define it as a source as well as a target mapping. Okay, so how to set primary secondary mapping for a single attribute source? There is nothing called a primary secondary mapping. You could define sources from multiple applications, as I said, multiple authoritative application, like we are doing for all our attributes over here. We are fetching it from authoritative employee application as well, or from contractor feed application. But you cannot give preference over here that one would be given preference over other. So for example, we had for certain users are present in one feed file, and certain contractors or all our contractors are present in one feed file. So that is why we have defined two source mapping. But we cannot give over here preference like primary or secondary. That preference mechanism is cannot be specified over here. So what is the difference between full name and display name? So the difference is full name over here is your application attribute, authoritative application attribute, and display name over here is an identity level attribute that is available. So display name is identity level attribute. So display name is identity level and full name is our application, authoritative application attribute. So these are available by default. So the question is last name, how it is displayed in SailPoint. When I view the field and identity attribute name is last name and display name is attribute last name. So they are populated by default, and we will talk about from where they could be changed. But when you go to global settings, some attributes are available by default and they are standard attributes. You don't have to touch them. They are standard to SailPoint. So we have standard attributes. We are modifying to define some extended attributes to store some extra values. But attributes like last name, first name are all standard attributes, and you don't have to touch them. You just have to modify their source mappings, which is not populated by default. Since they are internally mapped in your database. You don't have to modify them. And I will come to UI configuration. I will address your question then. I will come to UI mappings. So right now, what all changes we have done? We have talked about different advanced options, defined our identity schema. We have defined our identity schema and we have defined source mappings. So all these changes we have done. And now what we will be doing next is, now we also would like to do some UI modifications. We also would like to do some UI modifications. In these UI modifications, we would like to modify identity view attributes. See, right now, when I go to sale point, out of all the different attributes we have defined, I could only see some standard attributes are getting displayed. So when I go to any identity, I could see only some standard attributes are displayed. So what I want over here, I would like to add, or I would like to see some additional attributes. Say I would like to see some additional attributes like cost center, let's say status. So I would like to see all these over here. So by default, when you're adding extended attributes, they are not available in your UI. They're not available on your identity cube. You will have to modify a configuration file. So in order to add these attributes in your UI, we will be modifying a central configuration file called UI configuration file, where we will have an entry key, and this entry key that we will be modifying will be identity view attributes. Now, what is this identity view attributes? The attributes that you would like to see in your identity page or identity cube. So see, when I go to debug page, when I go to debug page, configuration object, we have this central configuration object called UI configuration. Now over here, you will go and search for this entry key. Now by default, this entry key will only contain your standard attributes. I will only be able to view by default standard attributes. So this is the entry key. It is called identity view attributes. It will contain name, first name, last name, email manager. That is what I am able to see over here by default. So you will modify this entry key to add your extended attributes which you have defined in your identity schema. So you will modify it to add some extended attributes like department, region, locations. All these I'm modifying this identity view attributes to add additional values over here. So see, this is my UI configuration file, and I could search for this entry key, identity view attributes. So I have modified this to add my additional columns like department, location, employee ID, region, which are not available by default. One important thing that you have to keep in mind while modifying this UI configuration file is you have to map to, so you have to map to attribute name. Whatever value that you have defined in attribute name, the same value should be added over here. The same value should be added over here. You could see over here, I'm adding cost center. So I'm defining over here cost center. So this is the same value that I've defined over here. So this is cost center. This is the same value that I've defined in attribute name. If you write it what is defined in display name, your value will not get displayed over here. So map it to your attribute name, not to your display name. So while modifying, make sure that you are adding your correct values in your entry key identity view attributes. So which values you have to add? The values that are there in your attribute name. Like I'm adding cost center. I'm adding over here cost center over here. So similar thing that you have to do so that these values should be displayed on your identity cube page. Similar requirement we have for identity table columns. So what is the identity table column? If you go back, over here, go to identity warehouse. This is called identity table. So this is identity table. Now my requirement is some additional columns should be available in identity table. So in this identity table, some additional columns should be available. So in this case, you can again modify the same configuration file, which is your UI configuration file, to add identity table columns, add additional table columns. I want to add two table columns, one that should display me the status, whether this user is employee or contractor. So I don't want to go inside each identity to see if it is an employee or a contractor. So I would like to add the status. And second thing that I want to add is whether these identities are correlated or not, or whether these identities are created from authoritative source or not. So these are the two columns I would like to add. So in this case, we modify this entry key called identity table columns. And these are the two identity table columns we are adding. So this is my first identity table column where I'm defining a column called status over here. And over here, I'm leveraging this property status. So this is the extended attribute that we have defined. So value of our extended attribute will be displayed in identity table column. What is the status? Property status. This property is the attribute that we have defined, identity level at extended attribute that we have defined. This is the status. So I want the same should be leveraged. So this attribute status would be leveraged and will be displayed in my identity table column. The second one, I'm leveraging an inbuilt property which checks for correlated over here. So property that is it is checking is called correlated. Whether this identity is correlated, meaning was created from an authoritative source. So this is the second column we are adding, in which we are checking for an inbuilt property called correlated. The header would be authoritative over here. So these are the two table columns we are adding. So again, we could go to our debug page, and again, we could modify our UI configuration file. And this time, searching for entry key identity table columns, and it should be exact match. So this time searching for identity table columns. So this is my exact entry key identity table columns, and we have modified it to add our additional columns, two additional columns as part of a business requirement. One is a field by the name status, and one is the field by the name correlated over here. So these are the two columns we have added. So these are the modifications we have made in our UI configuration file, adding two additional columns in our identity table. Once this is done, final thing that we will be defining, it is called manager correlation. What is manager correlation? I want that my manager value should be displayed. So a manager value should be displayed on my identity cube, and I should be able to create a link to the manager's cube. For this, we are defining manager correlation in our authoritative application definition. Let us look at this, where we will be defining this. So I'm going inside my authoritative application. So this is the authoritative application we define, contractor feed and employee. You will go to correlation tab. And in this correlation tab, you have this manager correlation. You have this manager correlation. So where I'm going to I'm going to application definition. I'm going to correlation tab. We are not defining account correlation. We are defining manager correlation. So over here, the manager correlation that we are defining, over here we are saying manager ID is my application attribute. Identity attribute is employee ID. See how correlation works? Correlation works something that SailPoint has and something that end application has. So what does end application has? End application has application attribute. What does SailPoint has? SailPoint has identity attribute. So that is why we talked about identity schema, and identity attribute will be central to your configuration. So whenever we define correlation, we will talk about something that SailPoint has and something that end application has. So in this case, we are saying that this manager ID, which is your application attribute, becomes a employee ID of a person in SailPoint. So this becomes a employee ID of some person in SailPoint. For example, look at this particular user 1A2A. So this 1A2A manager is 1A. What is this 1A in SailPoint? This 1A in SailPoint is a employee ID of a person that would be leveraged for correlating this identity cube with manager cube. So 1A, 2A is, so this 1A over here is what? Is manager ID, which is my application attribute. And over here, we will be saying that this will become a employee ID, which is your identity attribute in SailPoint. So this is a correlation that we will be defining in both our authoritative applications, manager correlation. So we have defined manager correlation. Okay. So we have defined source mappings. We talked about advanced option. We have modified UI configuration file and defined manager correlation. The final thing that I want is whatever changes that I have made should be displayed on my identity cubes. So whatever changes that we are making right now, I want these changes now should be pushed to identity cube. Now what we have done, we have already run our aggregation task. If we would have defined all these and then run our aggregation task, it would have been fine. But right now we have already executed aggregation task, and then we are making all these modifications like defining extended attributes, then defining source mappings. These are the things that we have done for both standard as well as extended attributes. Then we defined, apart from that, we made modifications to UI configuration file where we modified identity view attributes and identity table columns. And finally, we define manager correlation. So these are the changes we have done. And what I want now, that these changes should be pushed onto my identity cube. Whatever changes I have made now should be pushed onto my identity cube, should be displayed on my identity cube. So now you could leverage your refresh identity cube task, and this refresh identity cube task will push your changes to identity cube. So this is what this refresh task is going to do. So what I will do is I will go to setup, I will go to task. So I want whatever changes that we have made should be reflected on identity cube. So I would be running this refresh identity cube task. So what this particular task does, it refreshes all identity based on the configuration changes that you have made in SailPoint. So I would select two options over here. In this refresh identity cube job, I'm saying refresh identity attributes. This is the first option I will select. And I'm saying refresh manager status. since we have defined manager correlation. And now with these two selected, I will go ahead and execute this particular task. So now going to task results, I would be able to see the result of this particular task is currently getting executed. And one by one, it is refreshing each identities and making sure whatever changes that you have introduced in identity schema, in UI configuration files, that changes are being now pushed onto your identity cubes. So over here, it has discovered different managers, examined different identities. So now when I go to identity warehouse, I will be able to spot my changes. So first of all, look at two new additional columns are available, status and authoritative. Why these are available, status and authoritative? Because we made changes to our identity table columns. We were adding two additional columns, one by the name of status, second by the name of authoritative. So now they are getting displayed in my identity table. So these are the two identity table columns that we have modified in our UI configuration file. So I'm able to see them over here. So I could see over here which is employee, which is a contractor. I would be able to see status of different users. So I could see over here contractors, employees. The users that I've directly created are not employees or contractors. I could even see authoritative. Now when I go inside any identity, I want to go inside any identity over here. So for example, I want to go inside Adam Kennedy. So you could see now the changes have been introduced. So earlier there were only 5 default fields getting displayed over here. So now I see additional fields like department, location, employee ID, region, and so on. This change has been brought in because we made changes to identity view attributes by adding different values over here, so that this change was being made to our identity view attribute. We have added additional values that are being displayed over here now in our identity cube. Earlier, we were only able to see username getting populated and rest of the attributes were not getting populated. Now these are getting populated because we have made changes to source mapping. We have defined these extended attributes as well as defined source mappings for both our standard and extended attributes. That is why now SailPoint is able to calculate the source of these attributes, is able to calculate the value of these attributes. The next thing that we have defined is also a manager correlation. We've defined a manager correlation. The impact of this is I can see that the manager of this user, Adam Kennedy, is Douglas, and I can click on this particular identity manager and go to the identity cube of this particular manager. So this is happening because of the manager correlation that we have defined. Again, the manager of this user is Amanda. So I could go to the Amanda's cube. So this correlation that we have defined, because of that, this link is getting created with the manager's cube. And we were defining this manager correlation on our authoritative applications. So all these changes we have brought into our identity schema, where we have modified, made changes to UI, defined our identity schema, and looked at the different important advanced options available at identity level. And final thing that we were doing is running a refresh task to bring on these changes to our identity cube. Let me take some questions on the chat window. So I have explained this why manager correlation needs to be defined, so that this link is created between identity cube and managers cube, and you will be able to see these manager values displayed on identity cube. That is why you need to define manager correlation. Majid, this is available in advanced documentation. You can see the branding document uploaded over there in advanced documentation in the drive. When the permanent attribute is blank in SailPoint and the source system has some value, will it get updated or not? So if it is permanent over here, and if I have modified leveraging SailPoint form, as I discussed, it will not get updated. Since if you are having this attribute value set as permanent, the final source of truth is not the source mapping. The final source of truth is the new master value that you might have updated from SailPoint form. So in this case, if it is marked as permanent, whatever value change that we do is considered as the new master value. But if it would have been temporary, the new master value would always be calculated from source mapping. Same is the case with read only. So read only, whatever is coming from source mapping, that is the final value. Only in case of permanent, if you make any modifications of the value from SailPoint, like say leveraging SailPoint form, that will be considered as the final value. That will not get overridden. That is why these three edit modes are available, so that depending on your needs, you could control whether to fetch the value from a source system or whether you want SailPoint should be able to control the attribute value permanently. Okay, so let us go ahead. So now we have onboarded two authoritative applications and we have set our identity schema. So these two changes we have done. And now we continue with our application onboarding, looking at different types of application we can get. So the next application that we will onboard over here will be our non-authoritative application, and this application will be financials. Again, it will be a delimited file application, but with a difference. So till now, we were only populating our identity warehouse. We were only populating our identity warehouse. Now we will also look at populating our entitlement catalog. What is entitlement catalog? A central catalog storing all your permissions from your target applications. So this feed file application that we will have is giving us, so this feed file application that we are having is giving us application accounts or users. It is also giving us entitlements that these users are having. So we will be working to aggregate these users as well as these entitlements or permissions that these users are holding on target application. So I will be doing one unique thing in my application schema. In my application schema, the attribute that will be holding my permission, I can mark it as entitlement and managed. So understand this carefully, entitlement and managed. If you mark any attribute in your application schema as entitlement, what happens is this attribute will be available on your identity cube entitlement tab. So marking any attribute in your application schema as entitlement makes it available on identity cube entitlement tab. What is entitlement? So marking any attribute as entitlement exposes that attribute to different compliance modules. So for example, I have entitlement SOD policy. So I could leverage this particular attribute in my policy module. I have entitlement certification. I have entitlement based risk. So marking an attribute as entitlement in your application schema, SailPoint will start considering that attribute as a special attribute, exposing it to different compliance modules. And where it would be available? On Identity Cube Entitlements tab. Now managed is most important because what is managed? Marking a particular attribute as managed. And then in your aggregation task, you will have to say promote managed attribute. If you're doing that, the unique values of this attribute, the unique values of this attribute will get promoted to your entitlement catalog. So do not get confused between this entitlement and this entitlement catalog. Remember, whichever attribute in your application schema is marked as managed, that attribute is promoted. So you have to do two things. First of all, mark that attribute as managed in application schema. And then in your aggregation task, you have to click on this option called promote managed attribute. So unique values of this attribute will get promoted to entitlement catalog. Let us see this in action and then revisit it. So right now I have an application. Let me show you this application. So I'm going to implement a training data over here. And over here, we have a data of finance users.csv. So this is my data of finance users.csv. I will copy this and over here, I will paste this. Okay. So right now, this is my feed file. Now this feed file, apart from having my application accounts, it also contains my entitlements. Again, how would you know that? I talked about in my previous session about the application onboarding form. So you would be sharing this application onboarding form with your relevant application team, and they would be giving you all your details like connection details. They would be talking about what is their permission attribute. So all these things will be given to you by application team. So things like connection details and your identity attribute, which could be leverage for iteration, or your permission attribute. So all these things would be given to you by application team based on which you would configure it in SailPoint. So we have been informed over here for this application that we have identity attribute over here, DBID, not employee ID, because the same employee can have more than one database accounts. Like for example, this user 182C3A is having two DB accounts, one normal account, one privileged account. So DBID is our unique key over here. So DBID is acting as a unique key. Now we have an attribute called group member, which is my permission attribute identified on this application. So if I want to know what this user can or cannot do on my target application, this is the attribute that will give me this information. So I could see that this user is having access to account payable, account receivable, payroll analysis, and so on. So what we have, DBID is my identity attribute and group member is my permission attribute over here. So when I would be defining my application schema, I would be marking group member as my managed and entitlement attribute. Now, because I'm marking it as entitlement, it will be available in my identity cube entitlement tab. And because I'm marking it as managed, unique values of group member like account payable, account receivable, and so on will get promoted to where? To entitlement catalog. So we'll get promoted to entitlement catalog. Now over here, you could also see that this is a multi-valued attribute. For the same user, I could see multiple values of this group member. So this is a multi-valued attribute. Also, I could see over here, data is not merged. For the same user, we are able to see multiple lines. So we will also need to merge the data as it is being read from my target application. So we'll also have to implement merging as the data is being read. So for merging, let's say we have employee ID, we have username, and we have city. I'm giving you one example of merging. So let's say username over here is Peter and city over here is working out of multiple cities, but the record is of the same user. So these are the three cities this user is working out of for. And what is merging over here? Rather than displaying this record of the user in three separate lines, when it is read in SailPoint, I want data to look like this. And the multiple cities that he's working out of. So I want data to be displayed like this. So in this case, to implement merging, we have two important things. One is your identity attribute or unique key. Identity attribute or unique key. And second is your multi-valued attribute that needs to be merged. So in this case, our identity attribute is employee ID, that is unique key for this particular user, and multi-valued attribute that needs to be merged is city. So similar kind of thing we will be doing as we read data from this particular delimited file application, in which case multi-valued attribute is group member. So this is my multi-valued attribute, and my unique key over here is DB ID. So this is my unique key that could be leveraged for iteration on this particular database. So let us look at this application onboarding, and this would be similar to the other application that we onboarded. Since it is a delimited file, we will have similar kind of configuration. So let us look at this. So this is my financial application over here. I'm saying application name is financial, owner is administrator. Again, application type or the connector I want to leverage is delimited file. And it is marked as non-authoritative application. Look at the configuration over here. So again, I'm giving the feed file path. There is no file encoding. So if the file is encoded in formats like UTF-8, that could be provided and file could be decoded. File transport is set to local. It is present locally on the system. Parsing type is delimited and delimiter is comma. And we are saying file has column header on the first line. So file is having a column header. This is not a record. This is column header on the first line. And when I go to schema, as I talked about, so what I talked about over here, that by default in delimited file. So when I configure a delimited file, by default we get an object to manage, and the object name is account. And we have an option for discover schema attribute. That is one of the feature strings available. Discover schema attribute. So I would be able to discover my schema attribute. So over here, if I go down, if I click on this discover schema attributes, as we have seen in a previous session, these attributes will be brought into SailPoint like employee ID, DB ID, app to privileged. So when I'm doing that, these attributes are being brought into SailPoint. Employee ID, DB ID, all these are brought in. When I go ahead and click on discover schema attributes. Now over here, we have to define this identity attributes. I'm setting DB ID as my identity attribute. And I will also be setting my, apart from DB ID, I will also be setting a display attribute. So I will also be setting a display attribute. So I'm selecting username should be my display attribute. So I've set my identity attribute, DB ID, display attribute as username. Native object type is pre-populated in delimited file to account. This is the object SailPoint expects to manage in this target application. So over here, we are also marking our group member attribute as entitlement, managed, and multi-valued. As I've specified, what does entitlement, managed, and multi-valued means? So we have talked about what does entitlement managed means over here. And again, since in our target application we could see it is a multi-valued attribute, we have specified that in our application schema. I also want my data to be merged. So I can go back to settings, merging, and I'm saying data needs to be merged over here. When I say that, it is I have to provide two important things. One is my index column. My index column will always be my unique key or identity attribute. So I'm saying DBID. I'm saying DBID is my index column. Which column should be merged? This should be my multi-valued attribute. So this is my multi-valued attribute that we want to merge. So over here, we are specifying that this attribute should be merged, and I'm saying that data should be sorted by my index column, that is DBID. So we will do a test connection now, whether we are able to connect to target or not. So test is successful. And coming back to schema, I will do the preview. So when I do the preview over here, now you could see that this preview, without actually aggregating the data, it is helping you to simulate based on your configuration. So I could see that group member is now getting merged. So for every unique DB ID, which is my index column, I could see that my data is now getting merged. So we could define merging to merge the data as it is being read from target application. We also have a rule available. So if I would like to implement advanced merging capability, merge on more than two attributes, I could also leverage this rule, merge map rule, which we will discuss as well later. So this connector rule could also be leveraged for implementing advanced merging capabilities. It could merge two maps together. But right now, we are going to configuration, settings, and leveraging this merging capability provided. So once all these things are defined, remember that this is a non-authoritative application that we are onboarding. And for every non-authoritative application, our intention is not to create a new identity cube, is to link these application accounts to existing identity cube. So for this, we will be defining correlation. Again, just like merging, correlation can either be account correlation, account-based correlation, or could be leveraging a correlation rule. If both are configured, if both account-based correlation and rule are configured, the first preference is given to a rule, after which account correlation is run. So remember, if both are configured, rule would be executed first, followed by account correlation. So over here, either I could define this account correlation, or I could go to rule or define this aggregation rule called correlation rule. Right now, I want to leverage account correlation. So I will go to new. Next over here, I'm defining this correlation. Now in correlation, you have to define something that is available with target application, something that is available with SailPoint. So what is available with target application? Application attributes. These attributes are available with your target application. And with SailPoint, we have these identity schema or identity attributes that we configured. So we are saying that employee ID, which is application attribute, is employee ID, which is my identity attribute. So which means when this record is being read, this first record, this is being read, I want SailPoint to search if by this employee ID, a identity cube already exists in SailPoint or not. If it is able to find that, it should not create a new cube. It should link this account with existing identity cube, leveraging this correlation that I'm defining. So this is my correlation that we have defined. So we have tested our configuration. Gone ahead and we have gone ahead and defined a correlation as well. The next thing in application onboarding is to create your aggregation task. So which aggregation task you would be creating? Currently, which object is available on target application? Account. So we will be creating account aggregation task. So we'll go to setup, we'll go to task and a new task. And this time it will be account aggregation task that we would be creating. So this is my account aggregation task. So similar options we are selecting: aggregate financial applications, application to scan is financials, and over here we are selecting the same options: detect deleted accounts, disable optimization of unchanged accounts. We've talked about what are these. We are selecting an additional option to promote managed attribute. We have already defined in our application a managed attribute. I already talked about. We have marked this attribute as managed, and in our task we are saying promote managed attribute. What will it do? The unique values of this attribute will get promoted to entitlement catalog. So we are saying that, and with this option we will go ahead and execute this particular task. So I will go ahead and execute this particular task, and again our result would be available in task results. So I will go to task results over here and look at this particular aggregation that we are running over here. So this is running aggregate financial application. It is running, and once it gets executed, we have to check for two important things. Once this is executed, so this is executed, this is complete now, and it says accounts scanned, identities updated. It is not saying new identities created. So once your aggregation task is complete, you will check for two important things. What are the two important things we need to check for? The first thing that we need to check for is whether our correlation worked or not. So first thing we will check for whether correlation worked or not. Second thing that we will check for is whether our managed attribute got promoted to entitlement catalog or not. So managed attribute was promoted or not. Was promoted to where? To our entitlement catalog. So these are the two things that we will need to check. So we'll go ahead and check. So I will go to identity warehouse. I would open my identity cube, and after opening my identity cube, I will go to application accounts. I will go to application accounts over here. So when I go to application accounts, I can see that this identity cube was created because of my base application or authoritative application, that is HR system employees. And when I'm aggregating the data from my relevant application, it is not creating a new identity cube. It is linking the data to already existing identity cube. So this is what we will be able to notice. So you could see over here in this identity over here for this particular user. So this identity over here was created because of my authoritative application. And when I'm aggregating the data from my financial application, it is not creating a new identity cube. It is linking this application account to existing identity cube, leveraging the correlation that we have defined. So our correlation is working. The second thing that we need to check over here is go to application entitlement catalog. And over here, you could see over here that all the unique values of which attribute, group member attribute, that was marked as managed, it is getting promoted in your entitlement catalog. So see, what is the impact of marking this attribute as managed? The impact of marking this attribute as managed is it is getting promoted to entitlement catalog. That is managed. What is the impact of marking it as entitlement? So see, when I go back to my user profile, let me go back to my user profile. So I'm going back to my user profile. I'm going to entitlements tab. Now I could see in entitlements tab what all entitlements this user is holding. So I could see over here what all entitlements of financial application it is having. So I could see over here it is having this payroll analysis. So this is the impact of marking it as entitlement. So marking the relevant attribute as entitlement will make this attribute value available in your identity cube entitlement tab. Marking it as managed will promote this attribute to your entitlement catalog. So this is very important to understand. What is this entitlement going to do? If you mark any attribute as entitlement, unique values of this attribute that the user has will get populated in the entitlement tab inside your identity cube. So I could see Adam Kennedy over here is having this particular access, is part of this particular group on financial application. Marking the attribute as managed will make it available in your entitlement catalog. All the unique all the unique managed attribute over here are getting promoted to your entitlement catalog. If you go to your debug page, whatever you see in your entitlement catalog is listed as managed attribute. So see, we have managed attribute. So all these are listed under managed attributes. So this should clear your confusion if you have any. So they are called as managed attribute in your object browser or on your debug page. So can I bring in only certain columns? I'm reading the questions on the chat window now. If anyone is confused between entitlement and managed, do let me know. A simple concept is managed goes to entitlement catalog, entitlement goes to identity cube entitlement tab. So that much you should remember. Managed goes to entitlement catalog, and marking any attribute as entitlement will make it available on identity cube entitlement tab. Can I bring in only certain columns from delimited file instead of all columns? So you could modify your application schema to only specify those attributes that you want to bring in, and only those would be aggregated. So depending on your application schema, this aggregation is working. As I mentioned in our previous class, whatever is part of application schema, only those attributes are aggregated and only those attributes can be provisioned. So it is based on your application schema. If you want to control which attributes you want to aggregate, modify your application schema. Okay, second question is instance attribute. What is instance attribute? So certain applications have multiple instances, and so for example, LDAP applications, or as we will discuss, one logical application. So if you have multiple instances of the application defined, you could leverage an instance attribute. We'll discuss that in our coming session. Okay, so with this, we have defined our application. The next application we will onboard over here is PAM application. Now, this application is different from our previous application. It follows a two object approach. So what is this two object approach? You could see two objects, users and groups. So you see users and groups. Now the previous application that we onboarded, now this application was giving us users or application accounts and was giving us entitlements. Now this application that we are onboarding, this application has already done group-based access control. What does group-based access control means? So this PAM application, rather than giving us users and entitlements in the same feed file, we were getting only single feed file in this case. Now this application has already done group-based access control. Now this group-based access control means rather than giving us users and entitlements, it is giving us users and groups over here. So entitlements over here on this target applications are further mapped into groups. So many entitlements are already mapped under group. So this application has done group-based access control. So in this case, we will be managing two objects on this target application, and these two objects will be account, which is available by default, and we will have to create a custom object type group. Now, why this is required? Since in this case, we will get two feed files, one containing my user details, second containing my group details over here. So what is group-based access control? Rather than directly giving us that these users are having these entitlements, this application has optimized the process and asking us to manage users and groups rather than users and entitlements. What does group contains? Group further contains entitlements in many to one fashion. So we will look at this particular application as well. So over here, now in this application, we have two feed files, PAM users.csv. So this is my PAM users.csv. And we have another feed file called PAM group permissions.csv. And as you could see in this particular application, I have a lot of attributes. So I would not be managing all these attributes in my application. So I would modify my application XML over here. So over here, this is my one feed file containing all my user details over here. What users are present on this target application? It contains my user details. The second over here contains which group the user belongs to. So this application is having 5 permission groups: accounting, IT, HR, finance, and administrators. So the users can be part of any of these groups on the target application. And these groups will further contain entitlements over here. So right now it is giving us these two feed files to manage our application, schema over here. In this case, we'll look at that, look at this application onboarding, and you could see over here that in my application schema, there are a lot of attributes. So I will modify the application schema to only keep the attributes that I want to aggregate from this target application and not aggregate everything from this target feed file. Similarly, over here in the group case as well, I will only be managing certain attributes. So let us go ahead and look at this application onboarding. Now PAM, do not get confused with privileged access management. The name of the application is PAM. It has nothing to do with privileged access management. So over here, this is my PAM application. I'm defining one owner and revoker. So this owner and revoker are leveraged when we will discuss our LCM modeling, lifecycle modeling over here. So access requests are generally routed to the owner of the particular object or owner of the application. And when I would be revoking access, the work items that will get launched will be handled by this particular revoker. So revoker would be responsible for revoking access from the target application. So I'm defining over here a owner and I'm defining over here a revoker. Again, this is a non-authoritative application that we are defining. The connector type is delimited file. So going to configuration, by default, we have a default object type that we have talked about. The default object type that is present is account. Now, since in this case, this application is following a two object approach, we will have to define a custom object type group. So I will add object type and we could add a new object type group. Once we do that, we will have object type account and we will have object type group. Object type account, which is the default object type, group is the custom object type that we are defining. In object type account, I'm giving again the feed file address of account file, pam users.csv. I'm specifying delimiter is comma, parsing type is delimited, file transport is local, and file has column header on the first line. So similar configuration. In the group again, I'm specifying my group feed file address, delimiter is comma, and file has column header on the first line. So similar configuration. Now, since we had defined two object types, we will have two schemas now. One will be my account schema and second will be my group schema. So we will have two schemas, account schema and group schema. So now when I go to schema over here, we will have one account schema and we will have one group schema. Again, since it is a delimited file connector, one of the feature strings that are available. What is feature string? Feature string specifies what features the connector provides. So for example, I will open this connector and I could see over here in my debug page. So what I'm doing is I'm opening my debug page. I'm opening my application object. And when I open my application object, I could look at this feature string. So this feature string that is available over here, one of the features that are available is discover schema. So I'm leveraging the same thing over here. In account schema, I'm saying discover schema attributes. So this will discover my schema attributes. It will bring in everything. And out of the attributes that I don't want to be managed, I could select those and delete those schema attributes. So those will not get aggregated when I run my aggregation task. So there are multiple attributes available in my target application. I'm only bringing the ones, you could see there are a lot of attributes present. I'm only bringing the ones that I want to aggregate over here. So only they are part of my account schema over here. So only these are part of my account schema. So now what I'm doing is I have to define my identity and display attribute. So I'm marking user ID as my identity attribute. And over here, I'm marking username as my display attribute. So this is marked as display attribute. I'm marking database name and permission group as entitlement. So I'm defining them as entitlement over here. Again, who will tell you whether these are entitlement or not? This would be specified by your application team. So I'm marking them as entitlement and permission group I'm marking as multi-valued as well. And similarly, I have a group schema over here where I'm aggregating again, I'm leveraging discover schema attributes. Now from this particular feed file, and I am keeping the attributes that I want in my group schema that I want to aggregate from my group schema. And again, I need to define over here my identity and display attribute. So we are setting over here permission group as identity and display attribute. So permission group is set as identity and display attribute. Native object type in case of account, it is pre-populated to account. Native object type in the custom object type that we are adding, it is pre-populated to group. So now SailPoint is expecting to manage account and group on my native application or target application. Now similarly, I'm implementing merging. So we are merging the data over here, and in merging, as I said, index column will be your identity attribute. So identity attribute is user ID, and which column should be merged will be your multi-valued attribute. So that is your permission group, which is a multi-valued attribute on my application schema. So this is merging that we're implementing. Now we could also filter in the data as it is being read in. So we also have filtering capability available. We could also filter in the data that is being read in. So one is we could control which attributes we want to aggregate. But out of, let's say I have a 10,000 record file, I could also decide which lines I want to read or which particular accounts I would like to read. So either I could specify number of lines to skip. So if I say 100 over here, it will start reading from 101 line. I could specify to filter out empty records. I could specify a comment character. So enter a comment character. Any line starting with this character would be skipped. So if I specify comment character over here, any comment character over here, let's say I specify comment character as test01. So all these records would be skipped in that case. So comment character would be any line starting with that particular line would be skipped. So for example, in this case, if I specify comment character as 1A, 2C, 3A, so the records of all this users would be skipped. All these would be read, but all these lines would be skipped when I'm reading. So this is comment character. I could also provide a filter string. So example of filter string is listed over here, like department equal to manufacturing. So I could specify like group member equal to account payable. So in that case, if I do that, records belonging to this particular uh, group member would be skipped. So these comment character could further be specified in order if you would like to skip a particular record from the data file or the feed file that you are aggregating from. You also have an option to do iteration partitioning or partition the data as it is being read in. You could also partition the data as it is being read in. So apart from filtering, you have iteration partitioning. So iteration partitioning is for optimization of the data or data optimization. So what does this mean? So what we have to do, so for example, let's say we are reading a file having 10,000 records. So iteration partitioning, you could divide rather than reading the data as a single chunk, you could divide the data into multiple partitions. And this partition should not be too small. So should not be too small and should not be too large. The reason is, so let us understand, let's say I'm saying that in this case, I would like to create partitions of 100 each, 100 records in each partition. So in this case, if my partitions are too small, after reading each partition, SailPoint will have to perform a commit operation. So in this case, your aggregation task would be slower. Your aggregation task would be much slow because it is doing a commit operation after reading each partition. If I specify a very large number, let's say I'm saying I would like to have two partitions of 5,000 each. I'm having two partitions in this case in a feed file having 10,000 records. Now in this case, let's say my aggregation task that I'm running fails, and this is failing over here after reading, let's say 4986 records. It has read 4986 records, and after that it failed. So now when I restart my aggregation task, When I'm restarting my aggregation task, I will have to read from record 1 again. Since my partition is very large, I was creating a partition of 5,000 each. So SailPoint would have performed a commit operation after reading 5,000 records. So if in this case this fails, again all my data that I have read till now is lost, is not committed to SailPoint database. So generally it should be optimized. So for example, if I create 1,000 objects in each partition and I'm creating 10 partitions, and again this scenario happens over here. If my aggregation task fails after reading these many records, so in this case my 4 partitions are already committed. My 4 partitions are already committed, and when I restart my task, I will start reading from my 5th partition, that is 4001 record. My 4 partitions would have been committed over here. So you could also partition the data as it is being read in for data optimization, so that data is divided into logical units rather than aggregated as a single chunk. So either this could be auto, partition mode could be auto, in which SailPoint would automatically partition the data, or it could be manually defined. I could define how many objects I want per partition. So right now we are going for auto. We want SailPoint to auto partition and optimize the process. So we have defined schema, and we will do a test connection. So I will do a test connection. Test connection is successful. Now, important point over here is the 2 schemas that you're having, you will also link these 2 schemas. So you would also create a link between account schema and group schema. Why this link is required? So this is like a foreign key relation. This link is required so that when I see any identity, I should also be able to see its group details. Let us see this in action. So let us understand it leveraging an example. So I also want to create a relation between account schema and group schema. So for example, I'm going ahead and I'm trying to add new application over here, and I'm saying type is delimited file. So I'm saying type is delimited file. If I do that, if I go to configuration, by default, as we discussed, we will have only object type account. We'll have only a default object type account. If I go to schema, if I say add new schema attribute, you could see over here the types that are available are string, long, int, and boolean. If I go back and add a custom object type that we were adding in our application like group, so now I have 2 object types available, account and group. So when I go back to schema, again I have 2 schemas, account and group. So I could now specify an attribute of the type group. I could add an attribute over here, and I could specify that it is of the type group. What is group over here? The custom object type that we have created. This is the same thing we are doing in our schema as well. We are saying that this permission group over here is of the type group, thereby creating a relation between account schema and group schema over here. So this is my permission group. So we are relating account schema with group schema, thereby linking both our account and group schema. And see over here, I'm not marking them as managed. I'm only marking them as entitlement. No managed attribute have been defined in your application schema. Only entitlements have been defined. No attribute over here is marked as managed. So since it is a non-authoritative application, again, I will have to define a correlation, and I'm defining account correlation where I'm saying user ID is mapped to employee ID. User ID being my application attribute, employee ID being my identity attribute. So this is my correlation that is defined. So with all these definitions now made, we will preview our application schema. So I will preview my account schema, and I could see all my details. You could see permission group is getting merged because of the merging capability we defined. And we can also preview our group schema over here. So we both our previews are working. If your previews are not working, it means there is some configuration error that you have not configured it properly. So preview is a very good simulation. The limitation over here in preview is that it only iterates over first 10 objects from target application. So we have previewed, and now we are good to save our application. So now this is done. Now we'll also talk about a specific capability, and this specific capability that I will talk about is called connector debug. I'm not running my aggregation task now. Before I run my aggregation task, we will talk about this connector debug functionality. What is this connector debug? So this is more advanced compared to preview. Now preview is available in your application definition, and we are leveraging it to test whether our accounts are getting populated correctly or not. And the limitation that we talked about over here is it can only iterate over first 10 objects. Now connector debug is a functionality that could be used to debug your connectors. To debug your connectors before you go ahead and run your aggregation task. So debug your connectors. It is specifically useful with JDBC connectors, as we will see, when you have to test your SQL statements that you have written inside your connector. But right now we are leveraging this connector debug functionality. So I'm not running my aggregation task right now. I will first leverage connector debug to look at the functionality. So I will open my IQ console for this. Again, it is doing an integrity check. So now I've entered over here. I will write connector debug. So now you could see over here, these methods that are provided are test, iterate, and get. So we have three valid methods over here that are provided: test, iterate, and get, using which I could test my application connection. So what I could do over here, I could write connector debug, application name test. This will test whether I'm able to connect to my target application or not. So connector debug, application name test, and it is saying test is succeeded, meaning my application connection is working. The similar thing we could do in our UI as well, where we would doing test connection. Now, this time we are managing two objects in our connector. We are targeting two objects. One is account object and second is group object. So we have two objects, one default, one custom. So if I write connector debug application name iterate, it will iterate over my default object type, that is account. And there is no limitation. The end application can have 8,000 objects. It will iterate over all those 8,000 objects. So you will know whether your application connection or whether your iteration is working or not. And it will build those resource objects. And these resource objects are the ones that are built by the connector when it is aggregating the data from target application. So let us see this. I'm writing connector debug, PAM, iterate. So now it has built these resource objects. So over here, the advantage is that if the, so like in preview, we were only able to iterate over the first 10 objects, but there is no such limitation over here. It is building these resource objects for all the data that is coming in from your target application. So I'm able to see these resource objects. What are resource objects? They are built by the connector when it is aggregating the data into SailPoint. Similarly, if I would like it to be done for my custom object type, I will have to specify that. So connector debug, PAM iterate group, and now it is saying there are 5 objects available. 5 resource objects available. So these are my 5 resource objects available in my second feed file that I want to aggregate the data from. So connector debug can further be leveraged to iterate your data prior to aggregation and test your application connection. The same thing that you are doing in your UI can be done leveraging your command prompt as well. So we are doing this from our IIQ console. Let me just quickly show you connector debug. So this is connector debug over here, available via the Identity IQ console only. Iteration features, displays application link, accounts in XMLs, account, application, iterate group, and I could also test my application connections. Also displays associated rules if any, and output shows resource object just prior to correlation and creation. So this is the output shows your final resource objects prior to your aggregation that is built by your connector prior to aggregating the data onto SailPoint over here. So this is connector debug, another very good utility, specifically if you're working with JDBC connectors where you have to test your SQL statements. So you could leverage this to test your application connection, do prior iteration before aggregating the data. So once this is done, the final thing is now we will be creating aggregation task. Now, how many aggregation tasks you would be creating this time? 2 aggregation tasks, one for aggregating account and second for aggregating group. So now you will have 2 aggregation tasks. Your account aggregation task will impact your identity cubes. So will impact your identity cubes. Your group aggregation task will again impact your entitlement catalog. So what it is going to do, these permission groups that we are having. So when you run your group aggregation, these permission groups that we are having, they will be promoted to your entitlement catalog. Remember, entitlement catalog stores anything that is dealing with permission on target application. So account aggregation, when we run this account aggregation task, it will impact my identity cubes. And when I'm running my group aggregation task, we are impacting our entitlement catalog. In the previous application, we were doing this by defining managed attribute. So we were defining managed attribute, and by running account aggregation, we were promoting that managed attribute to entitlement catalog. But in the current context, we do not have a direct managed attribute. Rather, we have these permission groups. So we are promoting these permission groups to our entitlement catalog, leveraging a dedicated task for group aggregation, since we do not have any managed attribute defined in our application schema. So what we are going to do now, we are going to create 2 aggregation tasks. So one for account, one for group. Account aggregation and group aggregation. So this aggregate PAM application over here. I will select my application to scan PAM. And then over here, the same two default options: detect deleted accounts, disable optimization of unchanged accounts. I'm not saying promote managed attributes since we do not have any managed attribute in application schema. So this is my account aggregation task. And then similarly, I will have a group aggregation task to promote these permission groups into my entitlement catalog. Again, I can select my application over here and go down over here and select detect deleted account groups. And over here, if there is no definition provided over here, I can provide a default description if a default description is not available. So this will be my group aggregation task. So these are two aggregation tasks over here that we are running. So aggregate PAM account groups, that is aggregating my groups over here into SailPoint. And then we have a account aggregation task that will be aggregating accounts into my environment. So let us look at the result of this. So this is my task over here. So it has scanned all the accounts, updated all my identities. So this is aggregate PAM application account aggregation task. So I have account aggregation task and a group aggregation task. So again, you will need to check for two things this time: whether your correlation worked or not. This is first thing you will check. And second thing that you will check is, apart from correlation, is whether now your group aggregation was successful. Whether your group aggregation promoted what? Your permission groups now where to your entitlement catalog. So we'll look at what user was present over here to see if correlation worked or not. So we have the user James Smith. So we look at James Smith, identity warehouse, James Smith. So when I go to application accounts, I could see that this identity was created from HR system employees. This is my authoritative application. And when I'm aggregating data from this application PAM, I could see that it is not creating a new cube. It is linking this application account to existing identity cube. So which means my correlation is working. Now also look at, we were creating a relation between account schema and group schema. So we were creating a relation between account schema and group schema by defining that permission group is of the type of this attribute is of the type group. So because of this relation that we were creating between account and group schema, see, I'm able to see which permission group the user belongs to. So I could go at accounting and I could see standard properties. I could see object properties. I could see members over here. Which members are currently holding this access? Now, second thing that we need to check is we need to go to application entitlement catalog. So see, as we are onboarding more applications, we are developing these two pieces. And when I write PAM over here, whatever data that was present in this feed file is now pushed onto my entitlement catalog. So when I open any of these entitlement catalog, so now you would understand what is called group-based access control. So this permission group if I add any user to this permission group, the further user will get access to all these entitlements. So rather than giving us direct entitlements, this application had done group-based access control where they were maintaining certain groups under which they had mapped these entitlements. So now SailPoint is aggregating these users and aggregating these permission groups, which contains further entitlements over here. And then I have the members that are currently holding access to these permission group. Another important point that I would like to add, you could always check whether for a particular application for any user correlation failed or not. You could check correlation failures. How you could do that? So you could go to identity, you could go to identity correlation tab, specify any application. So remember, only non-authoritative applications are present. So for example, I'm specifying financials and I can see only for one user correlation failed. We'll also talk about how to correct correlation for any, for if we get any failures, how to correct correlation and how to manually correlate or perform merge. We'll talk about in our coming sessions, but you could leverage this to check if on your target application, were there any correlation failures. So I could see for these two entities, there were correlation failures. And for all my other users, correlation is successful. We'll talk about reasons why correlation could fail and how we could manually correlate them in our coming session. But you could track always your correlation failures in your environment. Okay, so question over here on the chat window is, can I do a refresh for one specific account of a target system? So that is possible. You could go to setup, task. You could say refresh identity queue. So by default, this refresh happens on all identities. If you would like to refresh a single identity, you could leverage this filter string over here. So either you could leverage a filter string or you could leverage a population to do a refresh on single identity. You could even leverage SailPoint to create these filter strings for you. So you could go to intelligence, advanced analytics. Again, I will discuss it in my coming class, but what you could do, you could go to intelligence, advanced analytics, identity search, and over here, you could leverage these filters available over here. So for example, over here, all these different filters are available. So for example, I'm saying user name equal to Aaron.Nichols. This is the filter I'm adding. I'm saying add filter. I could go down and I could see that this filter is generated. I could then filter, copy this and copy this inside my refresh task. So now it would only filter on one identity. It would only filter, it would only run on this particular identity. I could even add more and more complex conditions if I want and see my filter string over here. So I could add my more filter strings if I want, and this filter string would automatically get updated, which I can then leverage in my refresh task. So this is how you could refresh a single identity. I will talk more about these filter strings as we go ahead, but either you could write it on your own or you could even leverage SailPoint Advanced Analytics to create these filter strings and leverage in your refresh task. So with this, we will take a break. Any other questions? Any doubts you have in managed or the two different approaches we talked about? A single object approach containing a managed attribute, or a two object approach where we were getting group based access control and we were pushing it to our target system. So these are the two different approaches we talked about. So any doubts that you're having in the two processes that we talked about? And after we come back, we will now talk about JDBC applications with SQL database. We'll try to aggregate from our SQL database now. Any doubts anyone is having? Okay, a question on the chat window is there any way to include 100 users in a filter string in refresh task? Yes, there is a way. So better way would be is you could create a population for that. So you could create a population for that and you could include those in your refresh task. So better way would not be to uh, would to leverage a filter string in that case if you don't have a filter. But for example, I could go to setup, I could go to groups. I have these populations over here. Let's say I would like to refresh these people that are in this particular population. Active contractors in London over here. And there are 8 users over here. I would like to refresh only these 8 identities. I would go to setup, task, and refresh identity cube. So apart from filter strings, I could also leverage group factories and populations over here. So I could create a population for my users and I could run it on that particular population. So in this case, refresh will only be running on those 8 identities. So better way would be that you save all those 8 identities in a population and then leverage it inside your refresh task. So they would be available, but I think after our sessions are over, they would be removed from the server group. So it's better that you download it now. So that would be recommended. But at least they would be available uh, till our batch ends.
This conference will now be recorded.
Please go on mute. Please go on mute. Thank you. Okay, so let's start a session. Okay, so we were talking about application onboarding, and the next application that we are going to discuss will be our JDBC applications. And as part of that, the next application that we will be onboarding will be Track. So this is the next application we will onboard. Okay, so let us discuss this application Track. Again, it is a single object application that we would like to integrate. And what we have to do, so let us go ahead and talk about this application. So this is an application that is exposing to us not a feed file, it is giving us a database that contains all the details. So over here we have this application Track, and we have a SQL database where we have the relevant tables present from where which we would like to aggregate our data now. So in this case, we would be leveraging a JDBC connector, and inside our connector, we would be writing our SQL statements. So let us look at the database. Now, if any one of you is working in your local machine and not leveraging the VM, they can go ahead, go to implementer training. So you could go to implementer training over here, implementer training folder, go to this admin folder, and over here you have the scripts available. So go to DDL and you have this Prism DDL. So what you could do, you could open with gedit, you could copy this particular script, and if you would like to create a database on your local setup, you could do that. You want to create this track database in your local setup, you could do that. So you have to open your command prompt. So over here, you could just paste the script. So whatever you have copied, you could just paste the script to create your database over here. So if I say show databases now, I will have my database over here created, and whatever database that I want would be created over here. So you could copy paste the script that you want from your VM and create your database. So if any one of you is working outside your VM, working with these JDBC applications, you could open your scripts over here. Either it could be Prism script over here. So this is one of the application we would integrate, or could be this track DDL. So I could just open it over here, copy it, and run it on my command prompt in my local system if I would like to create it. So it would get created and I could say show databases. And now my database would be listed over here, track. So if any one of you is working in the local setup, you could leverage this. Okay, so let us look at this particular database before onboarding. Since it is created over here, let us look at it. So I will say use track, show tables. Now this is a we would be leveraging a JDBC connector, and this is the database that we are having two tables, capabilities and users table. So I would be writing select star from users to list the contents of my users table. So this is the data present in my users table. And then I have select star from capabilities. This is my second table. So this is the data present in my second table. Now over here, now just like in my feed files over here, we have our table header available over here. So if I go above, these are my table headers available. So these are my table headers that are available over here: ID, username, first name, last name, email from table 1. And from my table 2, that is capabilities table, again we have table header available over here. So the table header is available over here. So they will serve as my application attributes. Now another important thing over here is, for a user over here, capability is my entitlement managed attribute. So on this application, what is my permission attribute? Capability. And this is one of the multi-valued attributes we are having that will tell me that what is the permission user is having on my target application. So in this JDBC application, capability will act as my entitlement managed attribute. And since I have two tables now, so I have two tables. One is my users table, second is my capabilities table. In this case, we are going for a single object approach. So we have a single object that will be account. And since we have two tables now inside our database, we would be leveraging a SQL query, and we would be leveraging our joins. So in this case, we would be leveraging a left outer join to combine the data from both my tables, user table and capabilities table. So in this case, we would be leveraging joins. Okay, so this is my database now. So let us go ahead and onboard this particular application. So the user that I logged in from is root, the password is root. So all these details have to be provided to my connector when I'm onboarding this application. All these details would be provided. So let us go ahead and look at the onboarding of this application track. So in this case, I'm leveraging now a JDBC connector, not a delimited file connector. So whenever you are aggregating the data from a database, be it Oracle database, SQL database, you could leverage a JDBC connector. So now I'm leveraging a JDBC connector. Owner of the application is administrator. Again, it is a non-authoritative application. Going to configuration over here. So earlier it was asking us for the feed file path, but now it is asking us for username and password. So the user that I logged in from is root. Again, password is root. I'm pointing to this track URL. So track is my database that I'm pointing to over here. So MySQL minus u root is my username, and again root is my password, and show databases. Now my database that I'm pointing to is my track database. So this is the database I am pointing to. From my SailPoint connector, I'm pointing to this particular database. Now over here you see two SQL statements are specified. SQL statement and get object SQL. So what are these two? So you have one SQL statement that is mandatory, and then you have a get object SQL which is optional. So what is SQL statement? The first SQL statement that you see, this is a mandatory SQL statement. This would act as a iterator of entire data on your target database. Iterator of entire data. This is a mandatory SQL statement. Leveraging this SQL statement, connector would be iterating your data on your target database. So this is iterator of entire data. The get object SQL, it is an optional SQL statement that we could provide in the connector. This gives connector the capability to iterate over a single object. So gives my connector the capability to iterate over a single object, to getting a single object from my target application. So we have one SQL statement, iterator of entire data, and an optional get object SQL to iterate over a single object. Now, as I said, since we have two tables inside this particular database, so when I say use track, show tables, I have two tables over here, capabilities and users, and we are using a single object approach. So just like delimited file, when you leverage a JDBC connector, by default, only object type account is available. So we are going with the default object type account, but we have two target tables to aggregate data from. So in this case, we have to use a join. And in this case, we are leveraging a left outer join. What is a left outer join? So left outer join in SQL over here that we are leveraging. So its left outer join will return all rows in the left table, that is A table, and all the matching rows found in the right table B. So all the rows of the left table and matching rows of the right table. So this is what left outer join does. So over here, you could see in my SQL queries, what we are writing, we are saying select star from user table. So we have a user table. So all the rows of the user table and the matching rows of capabilities table. Left outer join capabilities table on user ID equals to capabilities.id, order by user.username. So over here, I could test the SQL statement as well. So over here, if I paste this SQL statement, this is being returned by this particular SQL statement. So it is combining the data from both my tables and representing me the required data. Then over here, we also have a get object SQL. So this gives my connector the capability to iterate over a single object. You could see this is a mandatory SQL statement, but this is an optional SQL statement. So again, I'm leveraging a left outer join on user table with capabilities table where user.username equal to a specific identity. So this gives my connector the capability to iterate over a single object. So these two are specified. Now I could test my connection whether leveraging this ID, password, and the database URL that I'm pointing to, whether it is able to connect to this target application or not. So it is able to connect. And then when I go to schema, again, we would leverage this discover schema capability that we have. So if I leverage this discover schema attribute, my table header would be brought into SailPoint. So these attributes will be brought in my application schema. So this discover schema is provided just like in your delimited file connector. And again, what I have to provide, native object type is pre-populated to account, and I have to select my identity and display attribute. So I'm selecting username as my identity attribute. And then over here, username is also set as display attribute. So native object type is pre-populated to account. Identity and display attribute are set to username. And now, as I mentioned, capability over here on this application is my managed entitlement attribute. This is the attribute holding my permissions. So I'm specifying over here that this attribute is managed entitlement and multi-valued attribute. For a single user, it is holding multiple values. And again, we are implementing our merging capability with username in index column, and capability is the column that should be merged. An index column is your identity attribute, which is username. So I will again try to preview over here, preview my data. So preview is working fine, and you could see that capability would be merged, is getting merged. So in this application, we are leveraging a JDBC connector to, to aggregate from a SQL database. And in our connector over here, we have defined our SQL queries, two SQL queries, one to iterate over entire data, second to get a single object. Now the next thing over here is, after defining application schema and your connection details, since it is a non-authoritative application, you will have to define a correlation. Now this time, I'm not going for account correlation, but I'm going for correlation rule. Now, as I mentioned, if you define both, if you're defining account correlation as well as correlation rule, your correlation rule is executed first. So correlation rule would be executed first, followed by account correlation. If you have defined both, so the preference order would be correlation rule followed by your account correlation. Now, why write a rule when we can do it simply using account correlation? So most of the times you would be leveraging account correlation, but you could leverage correlation rule when you have to make correlation more robust. Let's say you have to do it on multiple attributes. You have to do it on multiple attributes. You want to make it more robust. So in that case, you could either write a correlation rule, or in account correlation, you could define multiple conditions. Both way it would work. So rule gives you more flexibility in terms of you could code and you could you could arrive at your custom correlation condition. So let us look at the rule. So this is our correlation rule that we are writing. See, whenever you're working with rules, so first of all, I will take a dedicated session next week on rules and APIs. So that is what I would take. But for now, when you're working with these rules, all you have to do is work with these arguments. So these are the arguments available in every inbuilt editor, and these are the returns. Further, you also have a description of the rule available, what this rule is used for. So for example, if I go down, it says identity correlation rules are used to find identities to which new accounts can be attached. So to which identities these accounts could be attached can be done leveraging this correlation rule. It says a correlation rule must return a map with one of the specified return arguments. So what we know that this must return a map. Now what we are doing over here, if you're not sure of what particular arguments we could use, you could double click on these arguments and it will list you what these arguments are. As I mentioned earlier, two arguments are available everywhere. That would be log and context. So no matter which rule that you're working with, these two arguments are available everywhere, log and context. Log is the log object associated with SailPoint context, and SailPoint context over here is to interact or query the database. Then you have other arguments that are rule specific arguments like account. So you could see account is the resource object returned from the collector. What is link over here? Existing link to this particular account. So these arguments are the ones that you would leverage in your rule, and return types is what you would return. Further, I would leverage different methods. As we interact with these rules, we would leverage different methods, and these methods could be found in your API documentation. So for API documentation, every environment comes with your API documentation. So in your URL, after identity IQ, write doc/java doc, and this will take you to your API documentation. For example, I'm clicking on SailPoint API. I'm clicking on SailPoint context. So I could see what all methods are available in SailPoint context, which I could leverage. For example, over here, I could see all different types of methods that are provided. So I could see what get context is going to do. Similarly, for other methods, get username will do, set username will do. So these are different methods that are provided, and I could see details of these methods in my API documentation. I have an encrypt method, I have a decrypt method. So all these methods are available, and I would be leveraging them in my while I am interacting or modifying these rules. So in this case, the account object that we have, so this is the account object that we have contains methods to get the ID attribute from the schema. So I'm saying account dot get string attribute ID. I'm checking if this user ID is not equal to null, and then we are returning this map identity attribute name employee ID and user ID over here. So if there is a match, the correlation would happen. So identity attribute name is what the attribute we will search on. The attribute should be searchable and available on all cubes. And this is the actual value of the attribute. So this is my correlation key in this case. We are returning a map. We are leveraging a hash map over here, and we are returning a map. So we could also leverage these correlation rules to correlate as we read the data from target application. So in this case, we are leveraging a rule. Again, I will do a detailed discussion on reading this API documentation. So this is I will do in my next session. So with these defined, with a rule correlation rule defined, test connection working, preview working, now we would leverage connector debug. Now the main advantage of connector debug is with dealing with applications that have SQL queries, because I could leverage connector debug to test my SQL queries that are configured in the connector. So I could write connector debug application name is track test. So I could see my application connection is succeeding. Now I would like to test my SQL statements. So I would write connector debug track iterate. So when I do this, it is going to leverage the first SQL statement that we defined, that is iterator of entire data from my target application. So when I do this, it leverages this SQL statement to connect to my target application and iterate the data on target application, leveraging this SQL query. So if it is not written correctly, this will fail. This connector debug statement would fail. So I'm writing connector debug track iterate. And now you could see it is iterating over different resource objects. So there were 156 resource object, and I'm getting all resource objects, and I'm seeing that my SQL statement is able to iterate over my data on target application. So which means this is correct. Second thing that I want to do is I would also like to test my second SQL statement to get a single object. So I could write connector debug track get account Adam.Kennedy. So I could do this as well, and this would iterate over my single object, as you could see. So I'm able to get a single resource object over here. I'm writing connector debug application name get a single account. So I'm writing connector debug application name, that is track get account, get a single account this time, Adam.Kennedy. So this is helping my connector to iterate over a single object. So this time I'm testing my second SQL statement, that is get object SQL leveraging connector debug. So both are tested now. So everything is working fine. We are able to get our relevant result as well. This iteration is working. I'm able to get a single resource object. So with these done, now we will create our aggregation task. So this time, since a single object is being managed, we will only create account aggregation. So aggregate track. So this is I'm creating account aggregation task. And now we would be again promoting our managed attribute. The managed attribute is capability that we would be promoting. So in this application schema, what we have done, in this application schema, we have defined one managed attribute, and this managed attribute is capability. So that we would be promoting as we go ahead and aggregate the data from this application. So all the unique values of this capability attribute, like input, reject, approve, and super, these are the 4 unique values. They will get promoted to my entitlement catalog, since we have managed attribute defined in our account schema now. Over here, we are selecting which application to scan is track. We are selecting our detect deleted accounts, disable optimization of unchanged accounts, and promote managed attributes. And with these things, I will go ahead and execute this particular task. And I could see my results over here. So this is currently getting executed. So it is refreshing each identities, and now this is completed. This aggregation task is completed. I can go down and I could see identities are updated now. And when I go to identity warehouse, I will check again for 2 important things, whether my identities are updated or not. So I will check for this user only Adam Kennedy, and we'll check our entitlement catalog. So this is the user we are checking. So I will go to application accounts, and over here now I could see that this identity was created because of my authoritative application, that is HR system employees. And when I'm aggregating from my LDAP application, from my uh, from my track application over here, I could see over here that this application link is getting correlated to my existing identity queue. So this is what we are able to see over here, that this correlation is working. And when I go to application entitlement catalog, we could see that whether capability attribute or our managed attribute was promoted or not. So I could see over here that for this capability attribute, this was promoted to my entitlement catalog. I can go to these entitlements and see the existing members of these entitlements or user holding this capability on my target application. So I could see currently these users are holding this capability on target. So now SailPoint has visibility which user is holding which permission on which entitlement on target application. So that visibility SailPoint is having now. So this was a track application, which was a JDBC application. So we were aggregating data from a SQL database now. Now sometimes what happens is the next application that we will onboard is leveraging a different method. We have another SQL database Prism that is leveraging now two object approach, users and group, like your PAM application, but we would be onboarding this in a different way. So next application that we would be aggregating is Prism. Again, we have a SQL database, my SQL database over here. And what we have over here in this application, again, we would be leveraging a JDBC connector. But this time we are having a two object approach. So when I say two object approach, what do I mean? That in this application, we would be managing account as well as group. So sometimes what happens is, let's say, can I do like this? I define an application in say a lower environment. I define application in lower environment, and I could take its application XML, make some connection changes if required. So connection changes meaning pointing to now the upgraded environment that you're having, pointed to the relevant database, and can I import that application XML? So will this work? So now what we are trying to do over here, we would like to create this application by importing a application XML. So as I mentioned, you could import any object from your environment. You could export any object from your environment and import it into your next environment after clearing the metadata. After clearing the metadata, so this is entirely possible. If you want to do this, you have to go to your debug page. So go to your debug page, open your application XML. So open your application object in your object browser, select which application you want to migrate. So for example, I'm saying I would like to migrate this contractor feed. So if I select this application XML, before you could, so over here what we have done, we have copied our application XML over here. So before I could import this into my next environment, we have to make sure that we clear all the metadata over here. So tags like created, ID, and modified, they have to be cleared. So this ID over here is only relevant in the current environment. If you do not remove this from your objects, your import will fail. When you try to import it into next environment, SailPoint would not be able to recognize this ID. So you have to make sure that all this metadata is cleared before you import these objects into your next environment. The same thing we have done in an automated way as well in our export task. And I also talked about an export script that you could leverage to export objects from your environment. So any of these could work. We also talked about this export script that you could leverage to export your relevant object. So even you could do this and paste it in your IQ console to export a particular object from your, so for example, this is for application object. So you could even export objects from your IQ console. And once you have this particular object, you could now import it into your any environment, thereby creating or onboarding that application into your, say if you're moving from dev to pre-prod, so from dev to pre-prod you could migrate that application XML and import it. So what you have to make sure before you could import, you have to make sure that all the metadata is deleted. And when I say metadata, I'm talking about these tags that I mentioned over here: created, ID, and modified tag. They have to be removed from your object XML before it could be imported into your next environment. So they have to be removed. Either you could do manually like I'm doing over here, or leverage the export task or export script to do that. So for the next application, we have an application XML, and we would like to import that application XML into our environment. So for doing that, we could go to global settings. We could go to import from file, and over here, I could go to browse, and over here is my prism.xml. I could go ahead, open, and import this into my environment. So this application XML will contain everything. So will contain my application definition, will contain my whatever rules that I'm leveraging, will contain rules, will contain aggregation task that I would have configured. So everything is in this application XML. So when I onboard this, I will be able to see this application in my environment over here. So you could either create the application, you also have the capability to import any object XML, be it application XML, into your environment. So you could also import. So over here, once we import, so this single application XML contains the following. It contains an application XML, rules for correlation, build map, and provisioning, tasks to aggregate account and account groups. As I mentioned, it is a multi-object application that we are onboarding. So let us look at its data, and then we will go ahead and aggregate from this particular application. So show databases, and now we have a database called Prism. So I'm saying use Prism, show tables. So now we have two tables, user table and group table. So this application, just like our PAM application, it is not giving us direct entitlements. It has done group-based access control where it is giving us these groups. So when I say select star from users, this is the data in my users table. So this is the data that is present in my users table. And then we have groups table that contains my group information. So select star from groups. So we have three groups that user can have: manager, super, and user. Now, since this application has already done group-based access control, we will be managing accounts and we would be managing groups. So since we have imported our application XML, now if I go to application definition, I will be able to find that this application XML has been imported. So I can open this application XML. So now everything is now defined in this application XML. So over here, the owner of this application is not an identity, it is a work group. In a preview section, we talked about work group. So over here, if I go to setup, I go to groups, we talked about that work group is a group-based access control approach of SailPoint. So these are work groups. So rather than making a single identity as the owner of this application, we have this work group as the owner. So all the identities that are member of this work group will act as application owners of that particular application. So in this case, we have this work group present, Prism application owners. The capability that is mapped over here is application administrator. And over here, I have two users. So both these users are now acting as my application owner of this application. So another common approach is you could define these, you could define work group as the owner of the application rather than individual identities. So that is defined. Again, it is a non-authoritative application. Now by default, in JDBC application, you have account object. So over here as well, we have to add a custom object type group. So by default, we have account object type, and here also we have to add our custom object type group. So these are configuration details. Again, connection user is root, password is root. This time we are pointing to Prism database, and these are our SQL queries. So in this case, since we are leveraging a two object approach, we have a two object approach and we have two tables and we will have two schemas. So there is no need of joins in this case. So there is no need of joins. I would be simply writing my select queries. So over here, when I'm dealing with my account object type, I'm saying I would like to select star from users. So this is my iterator of entire data. So star means everything. Select star from users table. When I want to get a single object, I'm saying select star from users where login equal to a particular identity. In object type group over here, again we are writing select statement, select star from groups, select star from groups where name equal to a particular identity. And again, same connection details, root pointing to Prism database. So since we have dedicated object types now available to manage account and group, there is no need over here of joins like we were doing in a previous application where we had a single object approach. So going to schema, we will have account schema and we will have group schema. And again, we have an option to discover schema attributes. So we are doing that. So I'm doing discover schema attribute in both account as well as group. So all of these things were populated once we imported this application XML. So all these things were part of my application XML. So in this case, we are making group as managed entitlement and multi-valued attribute. Native object type is pre-populated to account. Identity and display attribute are mapped as login. Going down in object type group over here, we are maintaining name and description, again by leveraging discover attributes. And identity and display attribute are mapped as name, and group is again pre-populated. So like we did in this application that we onboarded, we created relation between user and group over here. Similar approach we will be doing over here as well. We would be creating relation between account schema and group schema. So you could see over here, this is my account schema. So we are saying that this group attribute is of the type group over here, which is my custom object type that is available. So we are trying to create a relation between account schema and group schema. We'll go back to settings, try to do a test connection, whether test connection is working or not. So test connection is working now, and we'll go to schema And again, what you could leverage for detailed debugging capabilities, leverage connector debug. But since these are very pretty straightforward SQL queries, I'm not leveraging connector debug. These are not complex queries over here. These are simple queries. So I'm not going for connector debug, but you could go for connector debug and again look at whether it is able to iterate over your objects or not. So I can do a preview over here in account schema, and I can see account schema is getting populated. The fields over here, description and last login, does not contain any details. So that is why they are not populated over here. And then I can preview my group schema. So preview is working over here. And the next step over here is to define correlation. So I will go for correlation over here. Again, I'm not leveraging account correlation. I'm going for correlation rule. This time correlating on multiple conditions. So this time we are correlating on multiple conditions. We are first trying to correlate on login name. If that is not working, we are converting our first initial and the last name into lowercase letters, concatenating them and comparing it to our display name. So I have two conditions over here that I am checking on. In the first condition, I am checking on login name over here. I'm trying to correlate on login name. In the second condition over here, we are converting our first name and last name into lowercase letters and then comparing it over here with the display name. And again, we are returning over here a hash map. So again, we are returning over here hash map. If you are finding it difficult right now to understand this, we'll have a dedicated session on rules, tasks, and APIs, where I will explain more on these rules. So over here, we are trying to correlate based on our login name first. If that is not working, we are converting our first name and our last name into lowercase letters, concatenating them over here and comparing it with our display name, and we are returning a new hash map. So this is our correlation rule where we are checking on multiple conditions. So this time we will be running two aggregation tasks. We would be running two aggregation tasks, one for account aggregation and second for group aggregation. So we will have two aggregation tasks that we would be running this time because we have two objects maintained in our connector. So we have one account aggregation task, one group aggregation task. So an account aggregation task, similar options, application to scan is Prism, then detect deleted accounts, disable optimization and promote managed attribute, which is mapped as groups. And this is my group aggregation task for aggregating groups to your entitlement catalog. So task to aggregate Prism account groups. And again, we are selecting application to scan is Prism. And again, detecting for deleted account groups and providing a default description if it is not available. And again, we are executing this particular task. So over here, accounts are scanned, identities are updated. And similarly, I will check my group aggregation task as well. So this is my group aggregation task, where again, we are aggregating and updating these groups. So we'll check for the two important things. Again, we'll check whether correlation worked or not. And the second thing that we will check for over here is the second thing that we will check that whether our group aggregation task is able to populate our entitlement catalog. So again, this is my base application or authoritative application. And when I'm aggregating from Prism, I could see over here that these groups are that the user is part of, because we were creating a relation between account schema and group schema. So I could see which standard properties, object properties, and the members of this particular group are displayed. Similarly, I could go to application, entitlement catalog, and look at the Prism groups, whether they are available over here or not. So I could see that in my target application, I had 3 groups, and these 3 groups have been pushed by my group aggregation task to my entitlement catalog. Going to any of these groups, I could see over here object properties, and I could see the current members of this particular group. So these are the users holding access to this super group on my target application. So we have onboarded this application by the import functionality that the tool offers. So we were importing application XML, and we were able to see that this contained application definition, our correlation rule, and aggregation task. So when you're working with your JDBC applications, so what we did in these 2 applications, if you look at these applications, we either had a single object approach, where generally we come with a managed attribute, a permission attribute that we promote to entitlement catalog. Or you could have applications that expose multiple attributes. In that case, we have to create a dedicated aggregation task for account, a dedicated aggregation task for group. Apart from that, a custom object type is also introduced in your application definition to handle this group object type. So that is alternatively done. And both the connectors that we discussed, whether it was delimited file or JDBC, they gave you the capability to add a custom object type. So not every connector will give you a capability to add custom object type. So both in delimited file as well as JDBC connector, we were able to add a custom object type. So we'll discuss one last connector for today, that is LDAP. I will take the questions on the chat window, and after this we will discuss one directory connector, that is LDAP. Yes, you need to do that. So what Majid is asking, when we are creating 2 aggregation tasks for account and groups, do we need to mark group attribute in account is managed? Yes, you need to do that, because that managed attribute is also getting promoted to your entitlement catalog. If it is the same attribute, again, if it is the same attribute, it will not impact if you don't mark it. But if it is a different attribute in account schema and a different attribute in group schema, then this will impact your entitlement catalog. In this case, it is a similar attribute. If you look at the configuration over here, so when I go to application definition, when I open this Prisma application over here, when I go to configuration schema, so over here, this group attribute is managed entitlement, as well as over here, we are promoting this through our group aggregation task as well. So even if you run this, it will get promoted to your entitlement catalog. Your group attribute over here, unique values of your group attribute will get promoted over here. So, but the difference over here is, so if you do this, let's say in this group over here, people are only holding manager and user group, but super is not held by any of these users. In that case, it will not get promoted. But if you're running your group aggregation task, it is just looking at this target table and promoting all these available groups to your entitlement catalog. So the difference is, if you just do by promoting managed attribute, and let's say that you don't have any user with this super group, so you have only users with manager and user group, so only manager and user will get promoted to entitlement catalog, because these are the groups held with your users. So it will not promote your super group since it is not held by any of the users. But if you run your group aggregation task, it will look at your group table, and whatever groups that are available, everything will get promoted to entitlement catalog. So I hope you understood. So let me know on the chat window if you understood or if you have doubts. Okay. The next connector that we are talking about is directory connector. So directory connector are very important. What is a directory? First of all, we have to understand directories. So directory you could understand like a dictionary. So over here, the data is much more organized compared to relational databases or the databases, general databases that we talked about right now, like SQL databases. We were having a database, we were having certain tables. So data over there was not organized. The data was staged in a staging table. But when I talk about directories like LDAP or AD, the data over here could be organized into forests. So these are certain terminologies, into domains, trees. So data is organized so that retrieval of this data is much more faster. So when it is organized over here, the data retrieval is much more faster. And in when you're working in financially sensitive organization, like say airlines or like say banks, the time it takes to retrieve the data matters the most. So data is further organized into these directories. So what is LDAP over here? LDAP is also a protocol which is lightweight directory access protocol. So lightweight directory access protocol, it is also we also have compliant LDAP databases. So compliant to this protocol, we also have LDAP databases over here. Now these are different over here because when I configure a AD connector or when I configure a LDAP connector over here, SailPoint already knows the structure of these application. SailPoint already knows the structure. So as I was talking about how they are different from normal database. So let's say I talk about that you have to find a word in a particular novel. So it could be on the first page, it could be on the 50th page, or it could be towards the end of the novel. But if I ask you to search for the word in a dictionary, since data is organized, you could optimize the search process and arrive at the word that you're looking at more quickly. So data is organized. So similar case is with these directories. So SailPoint is already aware of the structure over here, how these AD is structured or how LDAP is structured. So that is part of connector definition. So things like application schema. So till now we were discovering application schema, but in these cases, application schema, provisioning pathways, things like that are part of application definition. Since SailPoint already knows what to expect if it is connecting with the organized directory like AD or LDAP. For example, let me show you over here. So for example, over here, I will go and I go to details over here. See, when I was selecting a delimited file, SailPoint does not know whether I will have one attribute, I will have 10 attribute in the feed file, or whether I will have 15 attributes. Similarly, When I was connecting to a SQL database, I could have 2 tables, 4 tables, 15 attributes. There is no standard. But when we are connecting to connectors like LDAP or AD, they're all application schema is pre-populated. So for example, over here, I'm selecting now, let's say, an Active Directory connector. So when I select an Active Directory connector, again, a postback is happening and my relevant forms are displayed. But right now, there is no need to configure anything. If I go to schema, my application schema is pre-populated. So I am managing 2 objects by default, account and group, and my application schema over here is pre-populated. You could see it is pre-populated over here because SailPoint is already aware what to expect when it is connecting to, say, an Active Directory or a LDAP. And unlike your delimited or JDBC connector, where you had an option to add object type, you do not have any option to add object type. By default, you could only manage account and group. These are the 2 object types that you could manage by default on target application. Similar is the case with LDAP as well. So when I select LDAP, again application schema is pre-populated. So I go to configuration. See, most of the details are pre-populated. I am managing account and group. And when I go to schema, SailPoint already knows all these details. Native object type is init person. In the previous connectors, it was account. SailPoint already knows which would be managed entitlement attribute. And again, it is linking it with my group schema. So all these details are part of my connector definition. So these are called in SailPoint well-defined connectors, since SailPoint already knows how they are structured and they are inbuilt into connector definition. So we'll look at LDAP and then we'll try to connect with LDAP over here. So before I could start uh, leveraging LDAP, I will have to start my LDAP instance. So I will say start LDAP. So this will start my LDAP instance. I'm starting my LDAP instance over here, and then I will open my LDAP browser. So this is my training database over here. I will open my connection over here, and you see over here, this is, so before I go to my database, I will show you some properties over here. So these are the properties we will be defining in our connector definition as well. So connection name is training, host name is 127.0.0.1, port is 389. We are not leveraging any encryption. We could use SSL or TLS if we want. Transport layer security. The provider over here is Apache Directory LDAP Client API. This is our provider. For authentication, we are leveraging a simple authentication, but we could leverage Digest, MD5, CRAM, Kerberos. All these could be leveraged. And again, if you select these, you will have to provide in your connection details. So right now we are leveraging a simple authentication where our bind DN or user is CN equal to manager, DC equal to training, DC equal to SailPoint, DC equal to com. So this is our bind DN and we have a password over here. I am checking authentication. This is working fine. So this is the same user we would be configuring in our application connector, SailPoint connector over here. When I go to browser options, we are saying that we will be able to get base DN from root DSC. And in edit options, we are saying modify order should be delete first rather than add first. So if both operations are lined up, first preference would be given to delete, then to add. So these are my connection details over here. And once I open my connection over here, we are able to see This is my root DN. D is equal to training, D is equal to sale point, D is equal to com. This is root DN. And then over here, this is the user that I am leveraging to connect to these OUs and get the data, get the details over here. I have one OU for group where all my LDAP groups are contained. I have one OU for people over here, different people. So different users over here. So these are my different users that are present in this particular OU. So before we onboard, you should understand some of the terms of LDAP, LDAP common terms. So these are some of the common LDAP terms that you should understand. So what is CN over here? CN is common name. SN over here is surname. DN over here is distinguished name. What is distinguished name? It's like the complete address. So for example, I'm looking I'm looking to get the groups from LDAP over here. So I have to give my complete DN. So this is the complete address or distinguished name where my groups are located. Or this is the DN where all my users are located over here. So DN over here is my distinguished name. So by default, we have two objects, that is init org person and group of unique names. These are the two objects present in LDAP. So see, when I'm configuring LDAP, when I select my LDAP over here, look at the native object type. So my application is LDAP, and by default, look at the native object type. One is listed as init org person, and the second object type is listed as group of unique names. So these are the two object types that are managed on LDAP over here, init org person and group of unique names. OU over here stands for organization unit. O is organization name. So as I mentioned, as you could see, the data is structured over here. I have a structured data and I could utilize this structure to iterate over it much more faster compared to conventional database. So let us go ahead and configure this particular application. Let us talk about configuration. So again, since most of the things are pre-populated, we will not find it much difficulty over here. So this is my LDAP application. I'm saying name of the application is LDAP, owner is administrator, application type is Open LDAP. Again, it is a non-authoritative application. Going to configuration, I'm leveraging the same authorization type that I discussed over here. So when I go to properties, the authentication type over here was simple, and this is my BindDN user and password. So this is the same I'm providing over here. User, BindDN user and password. Host over here is training.salepoint.com. So this is my connection name training. Then default port, it is leveraging 389. This is a LDAP port, 389 over here. Authentication search attributes is something we will discuss in our next session. Again, it is pre-populated. So these authentication search attributes are leveraged for pass-through authentication. What is pass-through authentication? We will discuss in our next session. But remember that these are pre-populated. We could leverage LDAP as an application to implement pass-through authentication in SailPoint. What is pass-through, how it is configured, we will talk about in our next session over here. We'll talk about three authentication techniques. So we'll talk about single sign-on, we will talk about pass-through, and we already know about native authentication, which I discussed in my previous session where we talked about encryption. So these are the three authentication techniques that could be leveraged in SailPoint: SSO, pass-through, and native authentication. And these authentication search attributes that you see defined over here are leveraged in pass-through. So these are pre-populated CN, UID, and mail. So by default, two objects are managed, account and group, and we do not have the capability to add a custom object type like we were doing in delimited or JDBC connectors. So in account, I'm specifying my account search DN, where my accounts are located. So this is where my accounts are located. This is the search DN of where my accounts are located. This is the search DN of where my groups are located. So this is what I'm providing in my connector configuration. So O equal to people, D is equal to training, D is equal to sale point, D is equal to com. Each account can belong to a particular group. So we are also providing group member search DN in account tab, and again the same DN in the group tab over here. I've also talked about filtering. So same filter strings could be provided over here as well if you would like to filter for particular accounts or groups. You also see over here in the connection details a search scope. A search scope could be 3 levels. So you have subtree level, you have base level, and you have one level. So these are the 3 search scopes available, and they will decide how extensive your search is going to be on your target application. So let's say our directory is structured like this. We have a manager, we have a sub manager, and we have a sub manager. This is how my directory data is structured. So depending on your search scope, what data would be discovered would vary. So subtree search scope is the most extensive search scope available. So in this case, all the data would be discovered. This is the most extensive. Then if I configure at base level, it will only do base level search. So in this case, only base level search would be done. If I go for one level over here, my one level, one depth search would be performed. So this search scope would define how extensive your search would be done, how extensive your search would be. So subtree is the most extensive. Base level will only do base level search. One level will only do one level search. So these are the search mechanisms available, subtree, base, and one level. I could decide at both account and group what level of search should be performed. Again, schema is pre-populated, so you don't have to do anything. If you don't want to manage certain attributes from SailPoint, you could go ahead and delete those schema attribute. But again, it is all pre-populated. If you don't want to manage certain attributes, you have the ability to delete them. You could also add a new schema attribute that you want, but by default, these are pre-discovered. Account, and again, native object type is init person. Managed attribute is group. Managed entitlement attribute. And then over here we have object type group, where we have group of unique names, which is again all pre-populated. And again, this is a non-authoritative application, so you will be defining correlation. And this time we are defining account correlation, where we are saying CN should be mapped to display name. So this is our correlation key. So this is our correlation key. Make sure that after you define, you also add this and then save. Then only it will displayed over here. Otherwise, correlation would not work. So we have defined one correlation key. And with this defined, we will be aggregating from this particular application. So since there are two objects now, account and group, two aggregation tasks needs to be defined, which will be account and group aggregation. So you have aggregate LDAP and aggregate LDAP groups. So similar things we are configuring. Application to scan is LDAP. Then detect deleted accounts, disable optimization, promote managed. I will go ahead and execute this particular task. So this is my account aggregation, and I would be running my group aggregation task as well. Going to task results. So this is getting executed now. It is completed. And now my accounts are scanned, identity is updated. And again, if I go to task results, this is LDAP groups. So we have scanned these groups. Groups have been updated. So we'll check for these two things in our identity cube and entitlement catalog. As I mentioned earlier, you could also check for whether a correlation failed for your application or not. So you would be able to check that as well. So over here, I could check over here that when I go to this identity, this is my base application, authoritative application. And when I'm aggregating from my track application, from my LDAP application over here, I could see that it is not creating a new identity cube. It is linking this application account with existing identity cube. And since we had a link between account and group schema, I'm able to see my group details over here as well. So I'm able to see what all unique members are there of this particular group, object properties, and all the unique members holding this particular group. And I could see over here the member details. And I can go to application entitlement catalog. And over here, I could see all my group information. So all my groups are getting aggregated. And again, if I go inside, I would be able to see my group details over here. So we have aggregated all the groups and the users that were present on 12DApp into SailPoint now. So right now our focus is on connecting these end applications to SailPoint. And we talked about different capabilities. So in our next session, we will talk about customizing these aggregation tasks. We'll talk about aggregating two more applications, that is special case connectors, logical and multiplex application. We will further talk about how we can customize schedules. We'll talk about rules task APIs, and then we will go ahead and discuss our module 2. So with all said, we should be able to complete till which page? I will tell you till which page you should be able to complete in your exercise deck. Next time when we will meet, you should be able to complete till page number. So please make sure that you practice these exercises. It is very important that you practice these exercises regularly. So you would be able to complete till page number 88. So till exercise 8, you would be able to complete. Now, throughout your exercises, some of you are appearing for Identity IQ Engineer exam. So throughout your exercises, it will ask you your understanding on different questions for which you have a dedicated answer key available. So you could check your answers over here in this dedicated answer key. So whatever questions are being asked as part of this implementation course, you could also see their answers in your answer key. And then you have this appendix as well that is covering all the different scripted installation or your terms implementation resources are listed over here for your projects. So you could leverage that as well. So additional exercises that you would be doing that I've posted yesterday on the group, that also you practice, for which you will not find it in the implementation doc, but you could leverage the document that I posted for completing those as well in your environment. And as I said, if somebody is practicing in your local environment, can copy these scripts from here and create these databases onto your local setup as well. So you just have to copy paste and paste it in your MySQL console to create these databases. Yeah, sure. I will send it to you. Any other questions, anyone? Before we wrap up for this week, anything you did not understand, any questions you're having, please go ahead and discuss.